Hey guys, tonight we're not diving into grand battles or the lives of kings and queens in the usual sense. Instead, we're tiptoeing down the narrow, cobbled alleyways of early modern Europe, leaning in to listen to the whispers, the rumors, the scuttlebutt that formed the invisible, often treacherous, social web of everyday life. We're going to explore a time when an ill-spoken word, a careless rumor, or a reputation for having an evil tongue could land you in some remarkably uncomfortable and very public predicaments. Imagine yourself in a bustling market square, surrounded by timber-framed houses leaning precariously over crowded streets. The air is a rich tapestry of smells: baking bread, wood smoke, livestock, unwashed humanity. And the dominant sound, beneath the clatter of commerce and daily chores, is the constant murmur of human conversation, the lifeblood of the community, but also the breeding ground for gossip. You probably wouldn't survive a week in one of these tightly knit, face-to-face communities without developing an extremely cautious tongue, an almost supernatural ability to feign deafness when necessary, and an encyclopedic knowledge of who was currently feuding with whom over a stray pig or a suspected dalliance, lest your own idle chatter mark you for some rather peculiar and very public restraints. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, it's a delight to see our global community of sleepy history enthusiasts gathering. Please do drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's wonderful to know where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in early modern Europe, a period that roughly spans from the late 15th century through the 18th century. Think somewhere between the Renaissance and the full swing of the Industrial Revolution. We could be in a bustling market town in Tudor England, a walled city in the German states during the throes of the Reformation, a village in rural France under the reign of Louis XIV, or perhaps a Dutch trading port humming with global commerce. While the specifics varied greatly across this diverse continent, certain social realities were common. Life for most people was lived in relatively small-scale communities, villages, parishes, town quarters, where everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew of them. Privacy, as we understand it, was a rare luxury. Your business was, to a large extent, the community's business. And in a world where literacy was not yet widespread, oral culture was paramount. News, information, social norms, entertainment, and yes, reputations were primarily constructed and transmitted through spoken words, through face-to-face interactions in the market, at the church door, in the alehouse, or over the garden fence. In such a society, your reputation was your most precious and most fragile possession. It wasn't just a matter of personal pride, it could directly impact your livelihood, your marriage prospects, your ability to get credit from a local merchant, your standing within the church, and even your physical safety. A good name, an honorable reputation, was painstakingly built over years of upright behavior, hard work, and conformity to community expectations. A sullied reputation, however, could be devastating, leading to social ostracism, economic ruin, and sometimes even formal punishment. It was like having a very public, very easily damaged credit score, but for your entire social existence. Goody Miller's reputation is so spotless, a neighbor might say. You could eat your Sunday pottage off it. Unlike young Master Fletcher, whose reputation currently resembles a well-used dish rag from the Boar's Head Tavern, this was also an age of profound anxieties and often violent societal shifts. The Protestant Reformation and the subsequent Catholic Counter-Reformation tore communities apart, creating deep religious divisions and an atmosphere of suspicion and mutual accusation. Wars of religion and dynastic conflicts swept across the continent. Social hierarchies, while still deeply entrenched, were also being subtly challenged by emerging merchant classes and new economic forces. And against this backdrop, there were the ever-present fears of witchcraft, plague, famine, and unexplained misfortunes, all of which could create a fertile ground for suspicion, scapegoating, and the perceived need for strict social order and moral policing, In such an environment, words had power, immense power. The nature of news and information dissemination was vastly different from our own. While the printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, was beginning to make its mark with books, pamphlets, and broadsides, these were not yet a daily source of information for the average person. News still traveled largely by word of mouth from traveling merchants, itinerant preachers, soldiers returning from campaigns, or simply from one neighbor to another. Gossip, in its broadest sense, talk about other people, their affairs, their behavior, was therefore a primary, if often unreliable, form of information exchange and social commentary. It was how communities made sense of themselves, enforced their norms, and navigated their internal relationships. It was the original social media, just without the delete button, and with much more immediate and sometimes very public consequences for a poorly judged post. So, why were loose lips considered so dangerous, so threatening to the fabric of early modern society, that authorities felt the need to devise such peculiar and public punishments for them? Firstly, slander and libel, false and damaging statements about others, and it could utterly destroy an individual's hard-won reputation, leading to tangible harm. Accusations of theft, dishonesty, unchastity, especially devastating for women, or heresy could ruin a person's life. Secondly, gossip, even if not overtly malicious, could sow discord between neighbors, disrupt the peace of families, and undermine the harmony of the community. In small, interdependent communities, social cohesion was vital, and anything that threatened it was viewed with alarm. Thirdly, certain kinds of talk could be seen as a direct challenge to authority, whether it was a wife scolding or talking back to her husband, challenging patriarchal order, a commoner criticizing a magistrate, or a priest challenging civic or religious authority, or someone spreading rumors that could incite public disorder or riots. And finally, there was often a moral and religious dimension. Unruly speech, malicious gossip, and lying were condemned by the church as sins. The tongue, as preachers often reminded their congregations, could be a dangerous and unruly member, capable of great evil if not kept in check. There was a particular anxiety, as we shall see, around controlling female speech, which was often stereotyped as being inherently more prone to idleness, vanity, and malicious gossip. Mainstream historical fact. In early modern Europe, a period characterized by the increasing power of both secular states and religious institutions, Protestant and Catholic alike, alongside the continued importance of local community norms, there was a heightened concern with social order and moral discipline, which manifested in attempts to regulate many aspects of personal behavior, including speech and public conduct. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some towns in early modern Europe had specific local bylaws or customary laws that attempted to regulate activities perceived as facilitating gossip or social disorder, such as eavesdropping, listening secretly to private conversations, or night walking, being out and about at night without good reason. Often suspected of illicit meetings or spreading rumors under cover of darkness, this indicates the level of official concern over the uncontrolled flow of information and the potential for verbal transgressions to disrupt the peace. You couldn't just lurk under your neighbor's window with a giant ear trumpet hoping to catch some juicy tidbits without risking the attention of the local watchman. Goodman Giles, is that you again? The town council has specifically outlawed recreational eavesdropping after Compline. Good night. Now, move along before I have to report you for excessive auditory curiosity. Historians still debate the extent to which the various efforts to prosecute or punish gossip and slander in early modern communities were primarily driven by genuine concerns for maintaining social harmony, protecting individual reputations, and upholding moral or religious standards, versus being, at least in part, a tool for reinforcing existing patriarchal power structures, suppressing female agency and public voice, or marginalizing those who didn't conform to community expectations. It was likely a complex mixture of all these factors, playing out differently in different times and places. So, yes, as we begin our exploration of the peculiar punishments devised for these evil tongues, remember the context: a world of close-knit, anxious communities, where reputation was paramount, where words had immense power to build or destroy, and where the authorities, both secular and religious, felt a strong imperative to keep those wagging tongues in check. The threat of gossip wasn't just an annoyance, it was seen as a genuine danger to the social and moral order. And the responses to it, as we're about to discover, could be remarkably inventive and uncomfortably public. We've set the scene in early modern Europe, a time and place where your good name was as valuable as your worldly goods, and where a loose tongue could bring not just social disapproval, but some rather inventive and uncomfortable forms of public correction. But before we delve into the peculiar hardware of these punishments, it's important to understand who exactly was being targeted. What did it mean to be a gossiper in their eyes? The terminology itself is a fascinating window into their anxieties and social norms, revealing a particular preoccupation with certain kinds of speech, and, as we'll see, certain kinds of speakers. Let's try to define the evil tongue as they understood it, and identify who was most likely to be accused of wielding it. The umbrella term gossip itself, then as now, covered a multitude of sins, from relatively harmless idle chatter about neighbors' affairs to more malicious and damaging rumor-mongering. But early modern authorities and communities were often more concerned with specific manifestations of unruly speech that they felt actively threatened social order or individual reputation. One of the most frequently targeted figures, and one almost exclusively female, was the common scold. The legal and social category of the common scold was a recognized offense in English common law and had parallels in many parts of early modern Europe, though the terminology might differ, such as Zänkisches Weib in German-speaking lands, meaning quarrelsome woman. This primarily targeted women whose speech was deemed to be habitually abusive, quarrelsome, railing, or generally disruptive to the peace of the neighborhood. A scold wasn't just someone who occasionally had a sharp word. She was perceived as a persistent public nuisance with her tongue, someone who constantly stirred up trouble with her loud, contentious, or abusive language. She was the neighbor everyone dreaded, the one whose voice carried across the market square, usually in a tirade against her husband, another neighbor, or perhaps just the world in general. Her defining characteristic was the unruliness and public nature of her offensive speech. Mistress Agnes is at it again. The townsfolk might sigh. Her scolding is so potent today, the pigeons have taken refuge in the church tower, and the baker's bread refuses to rise out of sheer intimidation. While the scold was a predominantly female archetype, men were not entirely immune from censure for verbal transgressions, though the labels and punishments often differed. A man who habitually stirred up lawsuits, quarrels, or public disturbances through his words might be accused of being a common barator or barator, an offense that focused more on the incitement of legal or civic strife rather than just general scolding within the domestic or neighborhood sphere. However, the sheer volume of recorded accusations and punishments for scolding overwhelmingly points to it being a charge primarily leveled against women. Then there were those who engaged in slander or libel. Slander was the speaking of false and defamatory words that harmed another person's reputation, while libel referred to the same offense committed in writing or print, though with lower literacy rates. Spoken slander was often the more common concern for ordinary folk. Accusations of unchastity against a woman, or of theft, dishonesty, or heresy against anyone, could have devastating consequences. These were taken very seriously, as they could destroy a person's standing in the community, their marriage prospects, or their ability to earn a living. Someone proven to be a malicious slanderer, a calumniator, could face severe penalties, both from secular courts and from ecclesiastical church authorities. Other related verbal villains included the busybody or the eavesdropper, individuals who made it their business to pry into the private affairs of others and then spread what they had learned, often with embellishments or malicious intent. They were the information brokers of neighborhood secrets, the ones who listened at keyholes or interrogated servants, all to gather material for their next round of rumor-mongering. And closely related was the talebearer or backbiter, someone who secretly spoke ill of others, sowing discord and mistrust between friends, family members, or neighbors. These figures, while perhaps not always subject to the most dramatic public punishments, were certainly viewed with suspicion and disapproval. seen as eroding the bonds of community trust. You wouldn't want to share your deepest, darkest secret with Goody Prudence the eavesdropper? By tea time, it would be the headline news in 3 parishes and possibly embroidered on a sampler. So, what specific kinds of speech were deemed so problematic as to warrant these labels and potential punishments? Challenging authority was a major concern. A woman talking back to her husband, contradicting him publicly, or usurping his household authority through her words was often seen as scolding. Similarly, speaking disrespectfully of magistrates, clergy, or other figures of authority could land anyone in trouble. Sexual slander, as mentioned, was particularly damaging, especially for women, whose honor and marriageability were so closely tied to their reputation for chastity. False accusations of promiscuity, adultery, or illegitimate births could ruin lives. Spreading discord and quarrels between neighbors was a common charge against scolds. In close-knit communities, neighborhood harmony was prized, and someone who constantly stirred up arguments, repeated insults, or fueled feuds was seen as a serious threat to that peace. Lying, perjury, false swearing in court, and bearing false witness were, of course, serious offenses, as they undermined the very foundations of justice and trust. Even just being excessively loud, clamorous, or railing in public, especially for a woman who is expected to be modest and quiet, could be enough to earn the label of a scold. The authorities in the community often associated these verbal transgressions with underlying character flaws. A gossiper or scold was seen as idle, having too much time for talk because they weren't minding their proper work. Malicious, envious of others, lacking in Christian charity, and, crucially for women, demonstrating a lack of self-control and a failure to adhere to the expected virtues of silence, obedience, and domesticity. The evil tongue was seen as a symptom of a disordered soul. It's also important to note the role of community perception. Often, an individual, particularly a woman, would acquire the reputation of being a common scold through the complaints and accusations of her neighbors long before any formal action was taken. It was this communal labeling, this consensus that someone was a persistent verbal troublemaker, that often triggered official intervention. Social historians continue to analyze whether the figure of the scold, as defined and prosecuted in early modern records, was a genuine reflection of widespread patterns of disruptive female misbehavior that truly threatened community order, or if it was more of a social construct, a stereotype disproportionately applied to women whose speech challenged patriarchal norms, or who were perhaps simply outspoken, assertive, or economically vulnerable. It's likely a complex mix. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes the very definition of what constituted scolding or disruptive speech could be remarkably subjective and context-dependent. Court records from the period sometimes show women being accused for actions that today might seem trivial, like arguing too loudly with a merchant over the price of fish, publicly berating a lazy servant, or even just being perceived as too opinionated or having too much to say for herself in public forums where female voices were not always welcome. It highlights how the policing of speech, especially women's speech, was often tied to broader anxieties about social hierarchy and gender roles. She expressed a firm preference for herring over cod in a voice clearly audible to 3 other shoppers, clearly a scold of the most dangerous order. So, as you picture these early modern communities, remember that the evil tongue was a very real and feared phenomenon. It wasn't just about harmless chit-chat, it was about words that could wound, disrupt, and subvert. And those who were perceived as habitually wielding such tongues, particularly women labeled as scolds, were about to find themselves on the receiving end of some truly peculiar and very public forms of correction. The stage is set, the definitions are somewhat clarified, and the instruments of punishment are being polished. We've identified the kinds of evil tongues that troubled the peace of early modern European communities: the scolds, the slanderers, the busybodies, and noted the particular anxiety surrounding women's unruly speech. Now, we turn to one of the most striking and specific instruments of punishment devised for these verbal transgressions, a device designed not just to shame, but to physically silence the scold's bridle, or branks. This rather grim piece of ironmongery resembling a cage or muzzle for the head, is a potent symbol of the lengths to which authorities would go to control what they considered disruptive female speech. Let's gently examine this peculiar contraption, its construction, its intended effect, and its chilling symbolism. Imagine, if you will, an object of stark, utilitarian cruelty, fashioned from cold, hard ironed by a local blacksmith. The scold's bridle, or branks as it was often called, particularly in Scotland and parts of England, was an instrument of public punishment, used primarily from the 16th century through to the early 19th century, though its use declined significantly in the later period. It was designed to publicly humiliate and, most importantly, physically silence individuals, almost exclusively women, who had been accused and convicted by local authorities of being common scolds, nags, or persistent public gossips. Its very existence speaks volumes about the perceived threat of an unbridled female tongue. You wouldn't find this in the local hardware store under advanced conversation moderators, but its purpose was brutally clear. What did it actually look like? While designs varied somewhat from region to region and over time, the basic structure was fairly consistent. It was essentially an iron framework or cage that was fitted over the offender's entire head. Think of it like a close-fitting helmet made of iron bands, perhaps with a hinged section at the back or side that could be opened to place it over the head and then locked or fastened securely. It would be heavy, cold, and deeply uncomfortable, even before its primary silencing mechanism came into play. The iron might be rough, perhaps a little rusty, adding to the general unpleasantness. It wasn't designed for comfort, that's for sure. New in the workshop, the blacksmith might announce, the Mark IV brank, now with extra head-squeezing action for those particularly stubborn opinions, not recommended for long conversations or sudden bouts of sneezing. The most crucial and most brutal feature of the scold's bridle was the bit, or gag plate. This was a piece of iron, often flat, sometimes curved, that projected inwards from the front of the bridle framework. This bit was designed to be inserted directly into the wearer's mouth, pressing down firmly upon the tongue. Sometimes this plate was relatively smooth, relying on pressure alone to prevent speech. More often, however, it was deliberately made more punitive. The bit might be roughened, have sharp edges, or even feature a spike or a serrated wheel that would cause pain, bleeding, and serious injury if the wearer attempted to speak, move their tongue too much, or resist the device. The message was unequivocal: your tongue has caused offense, and now your tongue will suffer and be silenced. It was a direct physical assault on the very organ of speech. To add to the humiliation, some bridles were fashioned with grotesque or symbolic features. The front of the bridle might be shaped to resemble a long, distorted nose or have animalistic ears attached, effectively caricaturing the wearer, turning them into a figure of public ridicule, a monstrous effigy of their supposed verbal sins. The symbolism was crude but effective. The scolding woman was transformed into something subhuman, an animal to be muzzled, her humanity temporarily stripped away by this iron cage. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some surviving examples of scold's bridles, particularly from Scotland, have a small bell attached to the top or front. This meant that as the unfortunate wearer was paraded through the streets, which we'll explore in the next section, the bell would jingle with every movement, drawing even more attention to their plight, announcing their shame to everyone within earshot. It was an audio-visual humiliation package, ensuring maximum public exposure. The materials and craftsmanship would vary. Most were made of wrought iron, a strong and durable material. They would have been crafted by local blacksmiths, who were the general metalworkers of the community. Some surviving examples are quite crudely made, purely functional instruments of coercion. Others show a surprising degree of craftsmanship, with riveted bands, hinged sections, and locking mechanisms, indicating that these were not just makeshift devices but recognized, if brutal, tools of judicial punishment. The precise origins of the scold's bridle, whether it evolved from earlier forms of muzzles used for animals like aggressive dogs or biting horses, or from specific medieval instruments of torture or public penance, or perhaps even from medical devices designed to immobilize the jaw, are not definitively established and remain a subject of historical research and speculation. Its emergence as a specific punishment for scolding women seems to consolidate in the 16th century, a time of heightened social anxieties and efforts to enforce moral discipline. The psychological impact on the woman forced to wear such a device must have been immense. Quite apart from the physical pain and discomfort, the loss of dignity, the public shame, the inability to speak or even to properly eat or drink while it was fitted, the feeling of being caged and dehumanized, these would have been deeply traumatic. It was a punishment designed to break the spirit as much as to silence the tongue, and its use was overwhelmingly, though not entirely exclusively, reserved for women. While men might be punished for slander or seditious speech in other ways like the pillory or fines, the scold's bridle was a uniquely gendered instrument, reflecting the particular societal anxieties surrounding female speech and perceived female disorderliness. It was a brutal assertion of patriarchal control, a physical manifestation of the idea that a woman's tongue, if not properly governed by herself or her husband, must be forcibly restrained by the community or the state. So, as you picture this iron mask of shame, remember that it wasn't just a museum curiosity. For hundreds of years, it was a real and terrifying instrument of social control, a tangible expression of a society's fear of the unbridled word, especially when spoken by a woman. Its cold, hard form tells a silent, chilling story about power, gender, and the price of speaking out of turn in early modern Europe. The next time you feel like complaining about a meeting that could have been an email, just be grateful it doesn't end with the town beadle showing up with one of these contraptions. We've now examined the chilling construction of the scold's bridle, or branks, that iron cage designed to muzzle the evil tongue, particularly of women deemed to be common scolds or disruptive gossips in early modern Europe. But the punishment didn't end with simply having this uncomfortable and often painful contraption locked onto one's head. The true terror and efficacy of the bridle lay in its public application, in the ritual of shame that accompanied its use. The bridled woman was not merely silenced in private, she was made into a public spectacle, a walking jingling if her bridle had a bell embodiment of communal disapproval. Let's follow, in our sleepy imaginations, the grim procession of a bridled parade, and understand how this public walk of shame was intended to restore order and enforce conformity. The process would usually begin with an accusation and a conviction, though conviction might be a rather grand term for what was often a summary judgment by local authorities. A woman might be repeatedly complained about by her neighbors for her quarrelsome nature, her abusive language, or her incessant gossiping. These complaints would eventually reach the ears of the local magistrates, the town council, the manorial court, or sometimes even the church court, though they often had their own forms of penance. If these authorities, after some form of hearing, which might be quite informal, deemed her a common scold, or a persistent disturber of the peace through her words, the scold's bridle might be prescribed as her punishment. The punishment of being paraded in public wearing a scold's bridle was intended as a severe form of social shaming and control, designed to make a stark example of the offender and to deter others, especially women, from similar perceived verbal transgressions and disorderly conduct. Once the sentence was passed, the application of the bridle itself would be a traumatic event. The iron framework would be forcibly fitted over the woman's head, the cruel bit or gag plate inserted into her mouth, pressing down on her tongue, making speech impossible and swallowing difficult. It would be locked or fastened securely, ensuring she couldn't easily remove it. This might happen in the local jail, the town hall, or even publicly in the market square. Then began the public spectacle, the walk of shame. The bridled woman would be led through the streets of her own town or village, the very community whose peace she was accused of disturbing. She might be led by a rope held by a beadle, a minor parish or town official, the jailer, or sometimes even her own husband, if he was seen as having failed to control his wife's tongue and was thus being shamed alongside her. This procession was not a quiet affair. The intention was maximum public exposure. The route would likely take her through the busiest parts of town, past the market cross, through the main thoroughfares, perhaps even to the church door or the local alehouse. Places where people gathered and where her shame could be widely witnessed. If her bridle had a bell, as some did, particularly in Scotland, its constant jingling would announce her miserable approach, drawing curious and often jeering onlookers from their homes and workshops. Make way for Goody Miller in her iron bonnet. The children might shout, a mixture of fear and cruel excitement in their voices. She's been crowned Queen of the Tattlers. The community itself was a crucial audience and, in many ways, an active participant in this ritual of humiliation. The reactions of the crowd would vary. Some might jeer, taunt, or even throw refuse-rotten fruit, mud, animal dung at the unfortunate woman, venting their own frustrations or reinforcing their sense of communal righteousness. Others might watch in silence, perhaps with a mixture of pity, fear that they might be next, or even a grim satisfaction if they had personally been a victim of the woman's sharp tongue. The power of this public shaming lay in its ability to isolate the offender, to strip her of her dignity, and to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable social behavior. It was a vivid, visceral lesson for everyone watching this, is what happens to women who talk too much, who scold, who disrupt the patriarchal order with their unruly words. The duration of this public exposure could vary. It might last for several hours, or in some cases. The woman might be confined in the bridle for much of a day. She might be tied to a public whipping post, the market cross, or the town stocks, which we'll discuss later as another form of punishment. Still wearing the bridle for an extended period, forced to endure the stares and comments of passers-by. All the while, the iron cage would be a heavy, painful burden. The bit in her mouth a constant torment, preventing her from speaking out in her own defense, or even from easily swallowing or crying out. The aims of this punishment were clear and multifaceted: public humiliation and shaming. To utterly degrade the individual in the eyes of her community, making her a figure of ridicule and contempt, the shame was intended to be a powerful corrective. Deterrence, to make such a terrifying example of the scold that other women and perhaps some men would think twice before engaging in similar verbal behavior. It was a lesson writ large in iron and public disgrace. Restoration of community order. By physically silencing a disruptive voice and publicly punishing the transgression, the authorities aimed to reassert control and restore the perceived harmony of the community. It was a symbolic cleansing of a social ill, reinforcement of patriarchal norms. The overwhelming targeting of women with the bridle underscored the societal expectation that women, in particular, should be modest, quiet, and submissive in their speech, especially towards men and figures of authority. The experience for the punished woman would have been devastating. Beyond the undeniable physical pain and discomfort of the bridle itself, there was the profound emotional and psychological trauma of such intense public shaming. She was being paraded as a monstrous caricature, her voice stolen, her dignity stripped. The social stigma resulting from such a punishment could be long-lasting, affecting her relationships, her standing in the community, and even her family's reputation for years to come. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Scotland is that in some burghs towns, the branks were sometimes kept chained to a prominent public fixture like the town cross or the tron, the public weighing beam located in the marketplace. An offender might be fastened to this spot, wearing the branks for a set number of hours, exposed not just to public view but also to the elements. This added another layer of physical hardship to the humiliation. The frequency of the actual use of the scold's bridle, as opposed to its very potent symbolic threat as a known instrument of punishment, and whether it was a relatively common punishment for persistent offenders or reserved for only the most notorious or unrepentant scolds, likely varied greatly by region, by specific local custom, and by the particular zeal of local magistrates. This is an area where historians examining court records and local ordinances continue to debate and refine our understanding. Some towns might have had a bridle that was rarely used but served as a powerful deterrent. Others might have employed it more frequently. So, as you imagine this grim parade, this walk of shame with its jingling bell and jeering crowd, remember that it was a carefully orchestrated piece of social theater, designed to inflict maximum humiliation and reinforce the boundaries of acceptable speech in a world that was often deeply anxious about the power of the spoken word, especially when it came from a woman deemed too loud, too angry, or too free with her opinions. It was a peculiar and peculiarly cruel way to tell someone to, quite literally, hold their tongue. We've now encountered the scold's bridle, that intimidating iron muzzle designed to silence and shame the evil tongues of early modern Europe. But this wasn't the only peculiar punishment devised for those whose speech or behavior disrupted the perceived peace and order of the community. Another equally public and humiliating, and decidedly more damp, method of correction was the cucking stool, or as it's perhaps more famously known, the ducking stool. This rather alarming contraption, often situated by a convenient riverbank or village pond, was used for a range of offenses, but common scolds and disorderly women were among its most frequent unwilling passengers. Let's gently lower ourselves into the chilly waters of this particular punishment and see how a watery warning was issued to wagging tongues. First, let's try to picture this device. The cucking stool or ducking stool, the terms were often used interchangeably. Though some slight regional variations in design or specific use might exist, was essentially a sturdy chair or stool, often made of strong wood. Sometimes it was a very basic utilitarian seat. But other examples, particularly those preserved in local museums today, could be more elaborately constructed, perhaps even with iron bands to secure the occupant, or sometimes with derisive figures carved into them to add to the shame. The crucial feature was that this chair was firmly fixed to one end of a long wooden pole or beam. This beam, in turn, was mounted on a pivot mechanism, often on a post or a small wheeled cart near the edge of a body of water, a river, a pond, a mill race, or even, in some coastal towns, the harbor. This setup allowed the chair, with its unfortunate occupant strapped in, to be swung out over the water and then lowered, or ducked, beneath the surface. It was, in essence, a seesaw of public humiliation, with one end decidedly wetter and less pleasant than the other. Anyone for a quick dip in the Scold spa. The town crier might sarcastically announce, "Today's special 3 dunks for the price of offending Goody Grumblenose," who was subjected to this chilly chastisement, while the cucking stool was occasionally used for other minor offenders, such as dishonest tradespeople like brewers who sold bad ale or bakers who sold short-weight bread. They might be ducked along with their adulterated wares. Its most notorious and frequent application, much like the scold's bridle, was for women accused of being common scolds, habitual gossips, or generally disorderly or unruly in their speech and behavior. It was seen as a particularly fitting punishment for a heated temper or a fiery tongue. What better way to cool such disruptive passions than with a sudden, involuntary immersion in cold water? The ducking stool was a form of public punishment used from the medieval period well into the early 19th century in England, Scotland, Wales, and also in colonial America, primarily for women accused of being common scolds, viragos, or for other forms of public nuisance or disorderly conduct, involving repeatedly immersing them in water. The punishment ritual itself was a highly public spectacle, designed for maximum shame and deterrence. Once a woman was sentenced by local magistrates or a manorial court to take the cucking stool, she would be forcibly strapped into the chair. This itself could be a struggle. Then the apparatus would be put into motion. She would be swung out over the water, often to the jeers, taunts, and laughter of the assembled crowd. The entire community might turn out for such an event. Then, she would be lowered into the water and submerged. Perhaps once, perhaps several times. The number of dunks and the duration of each immersion were often at the discretion of the officials conducting the punishment, or sometimes even influenced by the mood of the crowd. It could range from a quick, shocking dip to a more prolonged and terrifying series of submersions. The experience for the woman would have been horrifying. There was the public humiliation, being exposed and helpless before her entire community. There was the shock and discomfort of the cold water, especially if the punishment took place in winter or inclement weather. And there was the very real danger of physical harm. Prolonged immersion in cold water could lead to hypothermia. If the water was deep or the current strong, or if the mechanism was poorly managed, there was a risk of actual drowning. Though this was generally not the intention, it was meant to be a shaming punishment, not a capital one. However, accidents could and did happen. Furthermore, the water into which they were ducked, often the village pond or a town river, was frequently far from clean, likely contaminated with animal waste, sewage, and other refuse. So, Even if one survived the ducking itself, there was a subsequent risk of illness or infection. It was, by any measure, a brutal and terrifying ordeal. "Don't worry, Mistress Higgins," the beetle might say with a grim sort of cheerfulness. "This pond water is only mostly duck effluent today. Adds a certain character to the experience." What were the intended purposes of this watery warning? Public shaming and humiliation. This was paramount. The sight of a woman, often disheveled and soaked, being repeatedly dunked while her neighbors looked on and jeered, was a powerful tool for social degradation. Cooling heated tempers. As mentioned, there was a symbolic and perhaps quite literal idea of using the cold water to cool down a woman perceived as having a hot or fiery tongue, or a quarrelsome disposition. Deterrence. Like the scold's bridle, the ducking stool served as a stark warning to others, especially other women, about the consequences of stepping out of line in terms of their speech or public behavior. Symbolic cleansing. Water often has ritualistic associations with purification and cleansing. Some might have seen the ducking as a way to wash away the sin of unruly speech or to purge the community of a disruptive element. However crudely, a quirky or fringe tidbit is that some cucking stools were designed to be particularly elaborate and theatrical. Some were mounted on wheels, allowing the unfortunate offender to be paraded through the town before reaching the ducking site, thus maximizing the public exposure and humiliation. Others might have been specifically located near a prominent landmark, like the town bridge or mill, to ensure a large audience. The whole affair was a piece of grim street theater, with the scold as the unwilling star. Whether the primary intended purpose of the ducking stool was the physical punishment and discomfort inflicted through near drowning and exposure to cold, or the symbolic humiliation and ritual cleansing enacted through the medium of water, or, most likely, an indivisible combination of both, is a point of ongoing discussion among historians of crime, punishment, and social control in early modern society. The very physicality of the punishment, its direct assault on the body, suggests that it was more than just symbolic. Yet, the intense public nature of it also underscores the vital role of shame and community judgment. The ducking stool, like the scold's bridle, eventually fell out of use, largely by the early to mid-19th century, as public attitudes towards such brutal forms of shaming began to change, and as legal systems became more formalized and less reliant on these kinds of spectacular, community-based punishments. But for centuries, it remained a potent, if peculiar, weapon in the arsenal of local authorities seeking to control unruly tongues and maintain social order. A chilly and often terrifying warning to anyone, especially women, who dared to speak too loudly, too angrily, or too freely in the close-knit, anxious communities of early modern Europe. The next time you complain about the water temperature in your local swimming pool, spare a thought for the involuntary bathers of the cucking stool. Their dip was definitely not for leisure. We've explored the definitions of gossip and scolding in early modern Europe, and we've taken a close look at the scold's bridle and the ducking stool, punishments primarily, though not exclusively, aimed at silencing and shaming women whose tongues were deemed too sharp, too loud, or too troublesome for the peace of the community. But the arsenal of public humiliation didn't end there. For a broader range of petty offenses, including those related to disruptive or defamatory speech whether by men or women, though still often applied with a gendered bias, two other highly visible and deeply uncomfortable instruments of shame were fixtures in many a town square: the stocks and the pillory. Let's now turn our sleepy attention to these wooden restraints and imagine the public discomfort endured by those loudmouths and slanderers unfortunate enough to find themselves displayed within them. Imagine yourself in a bustling market square or on a well-trodden village green in, say, 17th century England or colonial New England, somewhere prominent, often near the market cross, the church, or the town hall. You would likely find these rather unsubtle pieces of public furniture. The stocks and pillory were widely used forms of public punishment in medieval and early modern Europe, as well as in colonial America, for a range of relatively minor offenses. These included public drunkenness, petty theft, vagrancy, breaking the Sabbath, and various forms of disorderly conduct or crimes of the tongue, such as slander, seditious words, or persistent public nuisance. They weren't designed for an afternoon nap, that's for certain. Let's first consider the stocks. Picture a sturdy wooden framework, consisting of two heavy hinged boards, one resting on top of the other. In these boards, one or more sets of holes would be carved, typically two larger holes for the ankles, and sometimes two smaller ones for the wrists, side by side. The unfortunate offender would be made to sit, often on a low bench or directly on the ground, with their ankles and perhaps wrists clamped securely between these wooden boards when the top board was lowered and locked into place. This forced them into a fixed, often cramped and uncomfortable and sitting position, their legs stretched out before them, completely immobilized and utterly exposed to public view. It's like being forced to watch an incredibly dull play from the worst seat in the house. But the play is just people pointing and laughing at you, and the seat is actively trying to give you a Charlie horse. The pillory from the old French pillory was generally considered a more severe and more humiliating punishment than the stocks. While the stocks confined the feet and sometimes wrists in a seated position, the pillory restrained the head and hands while the offender was forced to stand. Imagine a wooden post, or more elaborate framework, with a hinged wooden board at head height. This board had 3 holes, a larger one in the center for the neck, and 2 smaller ones on either side for the wrists. The offender would be made to stand, often on a raised platform to ensure maximum visibility, with their head and hands thrust through these holes and the board then locked shut. This position was incredibly uncomfortable, forcing the person to stoop or stand on tiptoe, their arms uncomfortably splayed, their head fixed and unable to turn away from the gaze and often the missiles of the crowd. Being in the pillory was like being the unwilling star of a particularly unpleasant public art installation, one where the art critics were encouraged to throw rotten vegetables. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes, for more serious offenses like perjury, seditious libel, or a repeat offense of spreading false news, the offender's ears might be nailed to the wooden frame of the pillory while they were confined. After their allotted time, their ears would be cut free, a permanent, disfiguring mark of their crime. For our sleepy PG-13 purposes, we can perhaps just imagine this as a very serious threat rather than a common occurrence, but it certainly underscores the potential severity of punishments related to false or dangerous words. Who found themselves in these uncomfortable wooden embraces for speech-related offenses, while the scold's bridle and ducking stool were heavily gendered towards women. The stocks and pillory could be used for both men and women, though men might be more commonly pilloried for certain types of verbal crimes. Slanderers who had maliciously damaged someone's reputation could be sentenced to a few hours in the stocks or pillory. Spreaders of false news or seditious rumors that threatened public order or undermined authority might find themselves similarly displayed. Someone convicted of common barratry habitually stirring up quarrels or lawsuits might also earn a stint. And while not its primary purpose, a particularly notorious common scold, if her behavior was deemed a severe enough public nuisance or if it involved public slander against prominent individuals, might theoretically find herself in the stocks as an alternative to, or even in addition to, the bridle or ducking stool, though this was less typical. The key was that the offense had to be considered a public disruption or a direct harm to reputation that warranted this very public form of shaming. The role of the crowd was absolutely central to the punishment of the stocks and pillory. These were not punishments carried out in private. Their entire efficacy depended on public exposure and the community's reaction. The offender was deliberately placed in a vulnerable, helpless position, at the mercy of their neighbors and fellow townspeople. The crowd's response could vary dramatically. In some cases, if the offender was seen as having committed a truly heinous act by community standards, or if they were particularly unpopular, they might be subjected to intense jeering, taunting, and pelting with all manner of unpleasant missiles, rotten fruit and vegetables, mud, animal dung, dead cats or rats, oyster shells, or even stones which could cause serious injury or even death, though that was rarely the official intention. This was a visceral, interactive form of punishment, where the community actively participated in the shaming. However, if the crowd felt the offender was being unjustly punished, or if the crime was seen as trivial, they might show indifference or even sympathy, perhaps offering a drink of water or a kind word, thus subverting the authorities' intent. The degree to which the crowd's often violent reaction during punishments in the stocks or pillory was officially sanctioned or merely tolerated by the authorities, versus being a spontaneous and sometimes dangerously uncontrolled expression of raw popular justice or mob mentality, is a complex issue for historians of crime, social control, and crowd behavior. It was a fine line between judicial punishment and mob rule. The duration of the punishment was usually for a set number of hours, often specified by the magistrate, perhaps 2 hours for a minor offense, or several hours, sometimes spread over multiple market days for maximum exposure, as for more serious ones. Even a relatively short stint would have been incredibly uncomfortable, leading to cramped muscles, aching joints, and the profound psychological distress of public disgrace. The only likes you'd get in the pillory were from the flies buzzing around the rotten tomatoes aimed at your head. Sometimes, to ensure everyone understood the reason for the punishment, a paper or sign detailing the specific offense might be placed above the offender's head in the pillory, or displayed nearby. Here stands John Miller, for falsely accusing his neighbor of watering down the ale, a crime John Miller is, ironically, famous for. Or, behold, Mistress Agnes, for proclaiming with a loud voice that the mayor's new hat makes him look like a startled badger. The stocks and pillory, then, were powerful tools for enforcing social norms and punishing those whose words or actions stepped too far out of line. They were a tangible, visible reminder of the community's power to shame and control its members. While perhaps less directly focused on gossip than the scold's bridle, they were certainly employed for loudmouths, slanderers, and anyone whose tongue was deemed to have caused a public nuisance or damaged the good name of others. It was public discomfort, publicly administered, for public transgressions of the spoken or sometimes written word. We've now spent some time with the rather formidable and very public instruments of shame used by secular authorities in early modern Europe: the scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the stocks, and the pillory, all designed to correct and deter those with evil tongues. But the local magistrates and town councils weren't the only ones concerned with policing speech and maintaining moral order. The Church, in its various denominations, whether Catholic or the emerging Protestant faiths, also played a hugely significant role in regulating what people said, how they said it, and the impact of their words on individual reputations and community harmony. So, let's now gently step into the slightly more solemn, but no less potent, world of the ecclesiastical courts and see how they dealt with pernicious prattle and harmful talk, often through a system of public penance designed to save the soul and restore Christian fellowship. Throughout early modern Europe, ecclesiastical courts, also known as church courts or spiritual courts, held significant jurisdiction over a range of moral offenses, including slander, defamation especially when it touched upon sexual reputation or religious standing, blasphemy, heresy, adultery, fornication, and sometimes even scolding or common gossiping if it was deemed to disrupt the peace of the parish or bring the church into disrepute. These courts operated alongside, and sometimes in conjunction with or occasionally in conflict with, the secular legal system. While secular courts might be more focused on public order and financial penalties, church courts were primarily concerned with sin, repentance, and the spiritual well-being of the community. Their aim was not just to punish the offender, but ideally to bring them to a state of contrition and to reconcile them with God and their neighbors. Though, it must be said, the process often involved a healthy dose of public humiliation to encourage that repentance. "Don't worry, Brother Thomas," a church official might say to an accused slanderer. "This public apology in your nightshirt is for the good of your immortal soul, and for our collective entertainment. Mostly your soul, though." How did a case typically come before a church court? Accusations could be brought by aggrieved individuals, the person who felt they had been slandered or defamed, by parish priests or ministers who had observed ungodly speech or behavior, or by church wardens, lay officials responsible for the upkeep of the church and the morals of the parish. Sometimes, accusations arose from visitations by higher church officials, like bishops or archdeacons, who would inquire into the moral state of the parishes under their jurisdiction. Once an accusation was made, the court would summon the accused and the accuser. Hear witness testimonies often from neighbors, who were, as we know, a prime source of information about everyone else's business, and conduct an investigation, though the procedures varied by region and denomination. If an individual was found guilty of an offense like slander, spreading malicious gossip, or publicly reviling their neighbors, the church court would impose a penance. These penances were designed to be both spiritually corrective and publicly demonstrative. One of the most common forms was public confession and apology. The offender would be required to stand before the entire congregation, often during a Sunday service when attendance was highest, and publicly admit their fault, retract their slanderous words, and beg forgiveness from God and from the specific person or people they had wronged. This was an intensely humiliating experience, performed in front of everyone they knew: family, friends, neighbors, and rivals. Imagine having to stand up in church and say, I, Agnes, did falsely and maliciously claim that Goody Margaret's prize-winning apple pie was, in fact, made with turnips and despair. I retract this foul calumny and affirm that her pies are divinely inspired. Please don't smite me. And also, can I have the recipe? Sometimes, this public confession would be accompanied by other ritual acts of shame. The penitent might be required to stand in a prominent place in the church, perhaps near the pulpit or at the church door, dressed in a plain white sheet symbolizing a penitent's garment, sometimes barefoot, and often holding a lit candle symbolizing the light of truth or their need for spiritual enlightenment. They might have to remain in this position for the duration of the service, a silent, shamed spectacle for all to see. Church court records from across early modern Europe are an incredibly rich, if sometimes rather depressing, source for social historians, providing detailed and often surprisingly colorful and verbatim accounts of neighborhood quarrels. Accusations of witchcraft, marital disputes that often involved verbal abuse or slander, and, of course, rampant gossip and defamation, offering intimate glimpses into the everyday lives, anxieties, and interpersonal conflicts of ordinary people. These records are like the unedited reality TV shows of the 16th and 17th centuries. Fines could also be imposed by church courts, payable either to the church itself for its upkeep or for charitable purposes, or sometimes as compensation to the party who had been defamed. However, the emphasis was often more on public acts of contrition than on purely financial penalties. In more extreme or persistent cases, particularly for offenses like heresy, unrepentant blasphemy, or egregious and repeated moral failings, the church courts could impose the severe penalty of excommunication. This meant being formally cut off from the sacraments of the church like communion or Christian burial and, effectively, from the religious and often social community. In an age when religious identity was so central to life, excommunication was a devastating sentence, carrying not just spiritual terror but also profound social stigma and isolation. It was like having your heavenly membership card revoked and your name put on a divine "do not admit" list. The church authorities often saw the control of slanderous and disruptive speech as vital for maintaining Christian fellowship and community order. Gossip that led to enmity between neighbors or slander that destroyed a family's reputation was seen as undermining the very fabric of a Christian community, which was supposed to be characterized by love, charity, and truthfulness. The penances were therefore aimed at mending these social breaches, at forcing offenders to acknowledge the harm their words had caused, and at promoting reconciliation, however strained or superficial that reconciliation might sometimes be. It's important to note that there could be considerable overlap, and sometimes conflict, in jurisdiction between church courts and secular courts when it came to speech offenses. A particularly serious case of slander might be heard in both, or one might defer to the other. The lines were not always clearly drawn, and this could vary significantly depending on the specific region, the religious denomination in power, Catholic areas versus Lutheran, Calvinist, or Anglican ones, and the relationship between church and state authorities at that particular time. The effectiveness of these church-imposed penances in genuinely reforming an individual's behavior or achieving sincere repentance versus merely enforcing outward conformity to social and religious norms, or primarily providing a public forum for shaming and the reassertion of authority, is a complex question that historians of religion, law, and society continue to explore. Did Goody Agnes truly feel remorse after her public apology for the turnip pie slander? Or was she just resentfully biding her time before composing an even more scathing critique of Goody Margaret's needlepoint skills? We can only guess, but for our sleepy purposes, imagine the quiet solemnity and underlying social tension of a Sunday service in an early modern European parish. The sermon is droning on. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and perhaps a hint of incense. And then a figure in a white sheet is brought forward to the front to confess their sins of the tongue before God and their assembled neighbors. It was a powerful, if peculiar, way of reminding everyone that words had weight, reputations were precious, and the church was always listening, ready to impose its own brand of penance for pernicious prattle. We've explored the official, legally sanctioned punishments for gossipers and scolds in early modern Europe. The iron bridle, the chilly ducking stool, the uncomfortable stocks and pillory, and the solemn penances imposed by church courts. These were all tools used by authorities, both secular and religious, to try and control unruly tongues and maintain social order. But official justice wasn't the only game in town. Sometimes, when the community felt that someone had grievously violated its unwritten moral codes, or when official channels were perceived as too slow, too lenient, or simply inappropriate for the offense, the people themselves would take matters into their own hands, meting out their own noisy, ritualized, and deeply shaming form of popular justice. This was the world of rough music, or charivari, a clamorous communal condemnation aimed at those who disrupted domestic harmony or public decency, including, at times, notorious scandalmongers or those whose gossip led to serious social rifts. Let's now listen in, from a safe and sleepy distance, to the raucous sounds of this unofficial community-led court. The term charivari, pronounced charivari, of French origin, is perhaps the best-known scholarly term for this phenomenon, but it had many local names across Europe. In England, it was often known as a skimmington ride, or simply rough music. In German-speaking lands, it might be called in a Katzenmusik, cat music, implying a discordant, unpleasant sound, Haberfeldtreiben, or other regional terms. Despite the variations in name and specific local customs, the underlying purpose and general form were remarkably consistent across many parts of early modern Europe. Charivari, or rough music, was a widespread form of popular justice and social shaming in early modern Europe, where communities, often led by young men or specific social groups, would stage noisy, often theatrical and ritualized, public demonstrations to express their collective disapproval of individuals who had violated important social or moral norms. It was, in essence, the community taking on the role of judge, jury, and very loud, very annoying orchestra. Who were the typical targets of a charivari? It wasn't usually for petty theft or minor assaults. Those were generally left to the official courts. Charivari was more often directed at offenses that were seen as undermining the moral fabric of the community, particularly those related to marriage, sexuality, and household order. Common targets included adulterers, both male and female, though the shaming could be gendered, couples where there was a significant age disparity, especially an old man marrying a young woman, or vice versa, seen as unnatural or driven by greed. Husbands who were beaten by their wives, a reversal of the expected patriarchal order. Wives who were seen as scolding or domineering their husbands again, a challenge to patriarchy. Individuals who remarried too quickly after a spouse's death, or those who engaged in other forms of behavior considered scandalous or offensive to public decency. While not its primary target, a particularly notorious gossiper or slanderer, especially one whose words had led to a public scandal, a broken engagement, or a serious community feud, could certainly find themselves on the receiving end of the community's rough musical displeasure. Their evil tongue was seen as a direct assault on social harmony. Did you hear about Thomas the Thatcher? A villager might whisper. His loose talk about the blacksmith's wife and the visiting peddler has caused such a ruckus. The young men are planning a skimmington for him tonight. Better bolt your windows. It's going to be loud. What did a charivari actually look and sound like? The key element was rough music. This involved the crowd, often gathering at night outside the offender's house, making an incredible, deliberate, and sustained racket using whatever came to hand. They would bang on pots, pans, kettles, and metal buckets. They'd use marrow bones and cleavers, traditional butcher's tools that made a good percussive clang. Tongs, fire shovels, and any other noisy household or agricultural implement. They might blow on horns, whistles, or even conch shells. The aim was to create a cacophony, an overwhelming, inescapable, and deeply unpleasant sound designed to harass, humiliate, and publicly expose the offender. It was the opposite of a symphony. It was an anti-symphony of communal disgust. Often, these noisy demonstrations were accompanied by theatrical elements, effigies of the offenders, crudely made figures representing them, and sometimes their illicit partner, if adultery was the issue, might be paraded through the village. These effigies were often depicted in compromising or ridiculous positions, subjected to mock trials or further humiliations, and then sometimes ritually burned, drowned, or torn apart at the climax of the event. The offenders themselves might be targeted with obscene or satirical verses, chants, and shouts, detailing their supposed transgressions in explicit and often very colorful language. Sometimes, the participants in the charivari might wear masks or disguises, partly for anonymity, partly to add to the carnivalesque, slightly intimidating atmosphere. The aims of these popular rituals were clear. Public shaming. To expose the offender's misdeeds to the entire community and subject them to intense humiliation. Expression of community disapproval. To make it unequivocally clear that the community did not condone the behavior in question. Pressure to conform or reform. To coerce the offender into changing their ways, or if they were seen as incorrigible, to perhaps drive them out of the community altogether. Restoration of order. By ritually punishing the transgression, the charivari aimed to symbolically restore the moral equilibrium and social harmony that had been disrupted. It was a form of collective emotional release and social cleansing. What was the reaction of the authorities to these often rowdy and technically illegal displays of popular justice? It varied. Sometimes, local magistrates or church officials might turn a blind eye, especially if they felt the target was deserving of communal censure, and the charivari served to reinforce norms they also supported. In such cases, it could be a tacitly accepted, if unofficial, form of social control. However, if a charivari became too violent, too prolonged, or if it seemed to be challenging the authority of the official courts or powerful individuals, then the magistrates might step in to suppress it, arresting ringleaders and imposing fines or other punishments. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the specific instruments and actions used in rough music often had symbolic meaning. For example, the banging of pots and pans. Kitchen items could symbolize the disruption of domestic order caused by an adulterous affair or a domineering wife. Riding someone backwards on a donkey was another common form of shaming parade, a ritual inversion of honor. Historians debate whether charivari primarily represented a form of conservative social control aimed at reinforcing traditional hierarchies like patriarchy and established moral codes, or if it sometimes contained elements of popular rebellion and social protest, allowing common people to voice grievances or critique the behavior of their social superiors, albeit in a ritualized and often indirect way. It likely served both functions at different times and in different contexts. For a notorious gossiper whose words had torn a family apart or falsely accused an innocent person, a charivari might feel like a just, if terrifying, communal reckoning. So, as you imagine the flickering torchlight and the deafening, discordant clang of a charivari echoing through the narrow streets of an early modern village, remember that this was the sound of a community taking its moral policing into its own hands. It was a peculiar, clamorous, and often unsettling form of people power, a raw expression of collective judgment against those whose words or deeds were deemed to have broken the fragile bonds of trust and order. It certainly wasn't a peaceful way to get someone to be quiet, but it was undoubtedly memorable, and for the target, it was probably a very, very long night. We've now explored a rather intimidating array of peculiar punishments in early modern Europe, from the silencing iron of the scold's bridle and the chilly humiliation of the ducking stool, to the public discomfort of the stocks and pillory, the solemn penances of church courts, and even the clamorous community justice of the Charivari, it's clear that early modern societies took the issue of unruly tongues, slander, and disruptive gossip very, very seriously. But why? What was it about mere words, spoken or whispered, that inspired such fear and such elaborate, often brutal, methods of control? To understand this, we need to appreciate the profound and often devastating real-world impact that gossip and slander could have in these tightly knit, honor-based communities. Words were not just fleeting sounds, they were potent weapons, capable of destroying lives, families, and the very fabric of social order. At the heart of this anxiety lay the paramount importance of reputation and honor. In early modern European societies, where formal record-keeping for ordinary individuals was limited and social interactions were intensely local and personal, a person's honor and reputation were deeply intertwined with their social standing, their economic viability, and even their personal safety. This was true for both men and women, though the specific components of honor differed. For women, reputation was overwhelmingly tied to their sexual chastity and their perceived piety and domestic virtue. An accusation of promiscuity, adultery, or premarital relations, even if entirely false, could be utterly devastating. It could ruin a young woman's marriage prospects, leaving her an outcast or forcing her into a much less advantageous match. For a married woman, it could lead to marital breakdown, public disgrace, and economic ruin. Given the limited economic opportunities for women outside of marriage or family support, a lost reputation for virtue could mean a life of destitution. So, when gossip targeted a woman's sexual honor, it wasn't just idle chatter, it was a direct assault on her entire social and economic existence. The fear of such sexual slander was immense, and the punishments for those who spread it when proven could be correspondingly severe, though often the victim still suffered from the lingering taint of the accusation. They say Goody Agnes was seen conversing a little too freely with the traveling tinker by the old mill. A whisper might start, and by nightfall, Goody Agnes's entire future could be hanging in the balance, all because of a few carelessly or maliciously spoken words. For men, honor was often linked to their honesty, their creditworthiness in business, their courage, their skill in their trade or profession, and the good governance of their household, which included the perceived virtue of their female relatives. Slander that questioned a man's honesty could destroy his business dealings, making it impossible to get credit or find trading partners. Accusations of cowardice could ruin a soldier's or a nobleman's standing. Being labeled a cuckold, a man whose wife was unfaithful, was a source of profound public shame and ridicule, as it implied he couldn't control his own household. Words that damaged a man's professional reputation or his standing as an honorable head of a family could have dire economic and social consequences. These concerns about reputation had very real economic impacts. In a world where much business was conducted on trust and personal acquaintance, a merchant or artisan whose honesty was impugned by gossip might find their customers melting away and their credit drying up. A farmer accused of sharp practice might find it difficult to sell his produce at market. Ruined marriage alliances, often crucial for consolidating property or forming business partnerships, could result from slander targeting a family's honor. Entire families could suffer economically due to the evil tongue of one malicious individual. The social consequences were equally severe. Someone targeted by persistent negative gossip or proven slander could face ostracism, being excluded from community gatherings, church activities, and the networks of mutual support that were so vital in early modern life. Neighborly relations could break down entirely, leading to long-lasting feuds between families or factions within a village or town. The peace of the church congregation itself could be shattered by accusations and counter-accusations of immoral behavior or heretical beliefs, often fueled by gossip. And of course, there could be legal consequences. As we've seen, both secular and ecclesiastical courts dealt with cases of slander and defamation. Being found guilty could lead to fines, public penances, or those humiliating public punishments we've been exploring. Furthermore, bearing false witness in a legal proceeding, a particularly egregious form of harmful speech, could result in severe penalties, as it struck at the heart of the justice system itself. The psychological impact on individuals who were the victims of malicious gossip or slander must have been immense. The constant stress, the anxiety of knowing that your reputation was being shredded behind your back, the shame of public accusation, the feeling of helplessness. These could take a heavy toll on mental and even physical well-being. Beyond individual harm, gossip and rumor could also incite broader public violence or disorder. A rumor about a merchant hoarding grain during a famine, or a false accusation against a member of a minority group, or seditious talk against the ruling authorities could quickly inflame tensions and lead to physical altercations, riots, or even more organized forms of collective violence. Authorities were acutely aware of this danger and were quick to try and suppress speech they deemed inflammatory or seditious. Perhaps one of the most terrifying potential consequences of persistent negative gossip, especially against women, was its connection to witchcraft accusations. In periods of heightened anxiety about witchcraft, particularly during the major witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, a woman who was already an outcast, who had a reputation for being quarrelsome, malicious, or unnatural in her behavior, often a reputation built on years of local gossip, was far more likely to be accused if misfortune struck the community. The scolding old woman, the village busybody who seemed to know everyone's secrets, the woman who muttered curses when offended, these were all figures who, through the lens of witchcraft belief, could easily be transformed by gossip from a mere social nuisance into a perceived agent of Satan, with potentially deadly consequences. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some court records from witch trials detail how accusations often began with seemingly minor neighborhood disputes and escalated through layers of gossip, rumor, and suspicion over many years before culminating in a formal charge of witchcraft. It shows the slow, insidious power of words to build a case against someone. The precise threshold at which harmless social commentary or everyday neighborhood gossip tipped over into actionable slander or a punishable offense in the eyes of early modern communities and their legal systems often depended on a complex interplay of the social status of both the speaker and the person spoken about, the gender of those involved, specific local customs and sensitivities, and, crucially, the perceived malicious intent and the actual or potential damage caused by the words. It wasn't always a clear line, which probably made life even more precarious for those with a tendency towards unrestrained chatter. So, when we see those peculiar punishments, from the bridle to the ducking stool, we need to remember the very real fear that underpinned them. Words were not seen as trivial or ephemeral. They were potent forces that could build or destroy reputations, maintain or shatter social order, and even, it was believed, bring about physical harm or divine wrath. The evil tongue was a weapon, and early modern society, in its own often brutal and peculiar ways, was desperately trying to keep it sheathed. We've spent a good deal of time now in the rather uncomfortable company of scolds' bridles, ducking stools, stocks, and pillories, and we've even peeked into the solemn proceedings of church courts and the raucous justice of the charivari. It's clear that early modern Europeans, across various communities, were deeply concerned with the power of the tongue and employed some rather inventive, if unsettling, methods to try and keep it in check. But it's important to remember that early modern Europe wasn't a single monolithic entity with a universally applied rulebook for dealing with troublesome talkers. While the anxieties about gossip, slander, and disorderly speech were widespread, the specific ways these verbal vices were defined, prioritized, and punished could vary quite significantly from one kingdom to another, from one region to the next, and even from town to village. So, let's take a brief, gently meandering tour across some national borders to get a sense of this diverse landscape of linguistic legislation and peculiar punishments. Pack your imaginary earplugs. Some of these remedies for an evil tongue were quite distinct. If we start in England and Wales, we find a legal system deeply rooted in common law. Here, the figure of the common scold was a formally recognized public nuisance, and the ducking stool was indeed a frequently prescribed punishment for women convicted of this offense. The scold's bridle, or branks, also saw considerable use, particularly from the 16th century onwards, as a tool for both silencing and shaming. The stocks and pillory were ubiquitous in English towns and villages, used for a wide array of misdemeanors, certainly including slander or seditious words if they reached a certain threshold of severity or public disruption. Alongside these secular punishments, the Church of England's ecclesiastical courts remained active after the Reformation, dealing with moral offenses like defamation, especially sexual slander, and imposing public penances, much like their Catholic counterparts elsewhere. Though with their own distinct Protestant flavor, English popular justice also had its version of rough music, often called a skimmington ride, where effigies might be paraded to shame those who violated communal marital or moral norms, sometimes sparked by particularly egregious local gossip. Goody Anne of Bristol was sentenced to 3 hours in the stocks for calling the alderman a pudding-headed poltroon. A town crier might announce, "Let this be a warning to all who would besmirch the dignity of slightly rotund civic leaders." Crossing the border north into Scotland, we find some similarities but also distinct emphases. The branks were particularly common in Scotland, perhaps even more so than in England, and many Scottish burghs towns kept a brank chained to a public structure, like the Mercat Cross or the Tron public weighing beam, ready for use. The Scottish Kirk Church, with its powerful Presbyterian structure and local Kirk Sessions church courts made up of the minister and elders, played an incredibly pervasive role in policing public and private morality, including all forms of sinful speech, slander, blasphemy, flighting, abusive, often ritualized verbal duels, though these could also be a form of literary entertainment, and general unruliness of the tongue were frequently brought before Kirk Sessions. Punishments could range from public admonition from the pulpit and being forced to sit on the stool of repentance in church, to fines or, for more serious or persistent offenders, referral to the secular authorities who might then employ the branks or other forms of public shaming. Slander against the clergy or nobility was taken especially seriously. If we drift over to the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and politically fragmented territory, the variations become even more pronounced. While the core anxieties about reputation and disruptive speech were similar, the specific instruments and rituals of punishment could differ. The concept of Ehrenstrafen, or honor punishments, was strong. These were designed to publicly degrade the offender's honor, instead of, or in addition to, branks or ducking stools. German towns might employ specific types of shame masks. Schandmasken. These were often made of metal or leather, and could be fashioned with grotesque features, sometimes symbolizing the specific vice of the wearer, perhaps a long, wagging tongue for a gossiper, or pig-like features for gluttony or perceived uncleanliness. The offender would be forced to wear this mask in public. Another German punishment involved forcing the slanderer to carry a slanderstone, Lesterstein or Schonstein, or a heavy wooden slander stick Lesterstecken through the streets, its weight a physical burden symbolizing the weight of their offensive words. And, of course, various forms of rough music. Katzenmusik or Haberfeldschreiben were very much alive and well in many German regions, used to shame those who violated community moral standards. In France, while the concept of the common scold as a specific legal category might have been less formalized than in England, there was certainly no shortage of concern about slander, calumny, libel, defamation, and public insults. Royal ordinances and local parliaments' high courts dealt with such offenses, often imposing fines, public apologies, or sometimes, for particularly egregious or repeated cases, more severe shaming punishments like being forced to wear a sign detailing one's offense, or even the pillory. Charivari was exceptionally vibrant and deeply embedded in French popular culture, a powerful tool for community self-policing, often targeting marital transgressions, but certainly capable of being deployed against those whose gossip had shattered reputations or caused significant social discord. Mainstream historical fact. While public shaming punishments for speech offenses were common across many parts of early modern Europe, the specific devices most frequently used at G, the scold's bridle and ducking stool being particularly prominent in Britain, while shame masks and stones were more characteristic of some Germanic regions, and the precise legal frameworks for dealing with slander and scolding varied significantly by jurisdiction and deeply ingrained local custom. Heading to the Netherlands, a society renowned for its bustling commerce and a degree of relative social tolerance for the era, public order and reputation were still highly valued, especially in the densely populated urban centers. While perhaps less prone to the more theatrical shaming punishments like the bridle, Dutch civic authorities certainly dealt with slander and disruptive speech, often through fines, banishment from the city for persistent offenders, or forms of civic arbitration designed to reconcile warring parties. The emphasis was often on restoring peace and ensuring that public discourse, even if robust, didn't descend into outright chaos that could disrupt trade and civic life. Their version of keeping a lid on it might have been a bit more pragmatic and less overtly brutal than in some other regions. Master van der Velde, your accusations against Master de Groot's tulip bulb enterprise have caused a most unseemly dip in the market. The burgomasters suggest a public apology, and perhaps you buy everyone a round of good Delft beer to smooth things over, or face a very hefty fine and a stern lecture on civic harmony. Finally, if we look to staunchly Catholic countries like Spain or the Italian states, the Inquisition and powerful ecclesiastical courts played a very significant role in policing all forms of speech that touched upon religious orthodoxy, blasphemy, heresy, and public morality. While simple neighborhood gossip might not always reach the level of an inquisitorial investigation unless it hinted at heretical beliefs or witchcraft, the Church's power to investigate, censure, and impose public penance for moral transgressions, including slander that damaged a Christian reputation, was immense. The infamous auto da fe act of faith was, of course, reserved for the most serious religious offenses and involved public processions, sentencing, and often brutal execution for unrepentant heretics. This created a general atmosphere of strict moral control where even lesser verbal sins would be viewed with grave concern by church authorities. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some Swiss cantons or smaller German towns, specific gossip benches, Lasterbänke or shamestones, Schornstein were designated in public places. Individuals convicted of slander or being notorious gossips would be forced to sit on this bench or beside this stone for a prescribed period, enduring the mockery and disapproval of their fellow citizens, sometimes with their offense written on a sign for all to read. It was a simpler, but still effective, form of localized public humiliation. The extent to which the observable variations in the types and severity of punishments for speech offenses across different European regions truly reflected deep-seated underlying cultural differences in attitudes towards concepts like honor, community, and individual expression, versus being primarily the result of differing legal traditions, e.g., common law versus Roman law influences, varying rates of state formation and centralization of justice, or specific religious confessional cultures, is a continuing and fascinating area of comparative historical study. What is clear is that no matter where you were in early modern Europe, speaking out of turn, spreading malicious tales, or earning a reputation as a public nuisance with your tongue could lead to some very peculiar, very public, and deeply unpleasant consequences. The methods varied, but the message was broadly the same: watch your words. We've taken a rather extensive tour of the peculiar and often unpleasant public shaming rituals used across early modern Europe to punish gossipers, scolds, and slanderers, from the iron grip of the bridle to the chilly embrace of the ducking stool, the uncomfortable display of the stocks and pillory, the solemn penances of church courts, and the clamorous community justice of the charivari. These methods, while varying in their specifics, all underscore a deep societal anxiety about the power of the spoken word. But beyond these often informal or locally administered punishments, what was the formal legal status of gossip and its more malicious cousin, slander, in the eyes of the developing legal systems of the early modern state? How did the law itself attempt to reach out and regulate these crimes of the tongue? Let's gently sift through the legal parchments and court records to see how unruly speech was, or wasn't, formally addressed by the long arm of the law. It's important to recognize that for much of the early modern period, especially at the local level, there wasn't always a crystal clear distinction between what was a sin policed by the church, a social nuisance policed by the community or local bylaws, and a crime policed by secular courts. The lines could be very blurry. However, most legal systems in early modern Europe did develop increasingly specific ways to address defamation. which generally encompasses both slander defamatory spoken words and libel defamatory written or printed words. Mainstream historical fact: early modern European legal systems, building on Roman law and medieval precedents, increasingly developed specific laws and procedures against slander and libel, recognizing the significant damage that defamatory statements could inflict on an individual's reputation, honor, and livelihood. Though the precise definitions, burdens of proof, and available remedies varied considerably across different jurisdictions and over time. Slander being spoken was often the more common concern in everyday life, especially in communities with low literacy rates. If someone falsely accused you of theft, unchastity, witchcraft, or some other crime or moral failing in front of witnesses, you could potentially take them to court. The difficulty, of course, lay in proving that the words were actually spoken, that they were indeed false, that they were malicious, and that they had caused tangible harm to your reputation or standing. This often involved bringing forward your own witnesses to attest to what was said and to your own good character. It could become a he said, she said situation, with the outcome depending heavily on the credibility of the witnesses and the social standing of the parties involved. But your lordship, the defendant might argue, I merely opined that Goodman Giles's prize-winning pig bore a striking resemblance to the pig that mysteriously vanished from my own sty last Tuesday. That's an aesthetic observation, not slander mostly. Libel, involving written or printed defamatory statements, became an increasing concern with the proliferation of the printing press from the late 15th century onwards. A printed pamphlet, a satirical ballad, or even a crudely drawn caricature could spread damaging accusations much further and more permanently than spoken words. Because of its potential for wider dissemination and lasting impact, libel was often treated more seriously by the courts than slander, and could sometimes attract harsher penalties. One interesting aspect of defamation law in this period was the question of truth as a defense. In modern libel law in many jurisdictions, if what you said or wrote is true, it's generally a complete defense against a charge of defamation. However, in early modern Europe, this wasn't always the case. While proving the truth of an assertion could sometimes mitigate the offense, the principle of the greater the truth, the greater the libel sometimes applied, especially if the true but damaging statement was deemed to have been made with malicious intent or was likely to cause public disorder or scandalize a person of high standing. The law was often as concerned with maintaining public peace and respecting social hierarchy as it was with abstract truth. So, even if it was true that Lord Pompous was a notorious cheat at cards, publishing a popular song about it could still land you in serious trouble if it was seen as undermining his authority or bringing disrepute upon the nobility. What about the specific offense of being a common scold? In English common law, this was a unique and highly gendered crime. A woman, and it was almost exclusively a woman, could be indicted by a grand jury or presented by her neighbors as a common scold if she was deemed to be habitually quarrelsome, abusive with her language, and a disturber of the public peace through her incessant railing. If convicted, the traditional punishment was, as we've seen, the ducking stool. This was unusual because it punished a state of being a habitual scold rather than a single, specific act of slander. It was about her overall reputation for unruly speech. For men who habitually stirred up trouble with words, the more common legal charge was common barratry, which meant frequently exciting or maintaining lawsuits and quarrels, either in courts or in the country. This was also a public nuisance offense, but it focused more on the incitement of legal and civic strife than on the scolding nature of the speech itself. Beyond these specific offenses related to interpersonal reputation, the law also came down very hard on seditious libel or seditious words. That is, any speech or writing that criticized or undermined the authority of the monarch, the government, the established church, or high officials of state. In an age of absolute or near-absolute monarchies and intense religious and political struggles, such speech was seen as a direct threat to national security and social stability. Punishments could be extremely severe, ranging from heavy fines, imprisonment, and public shaming in the pillory, often with ear cropping or branding for repeat offenders, to charges of treason, which carried the death penalty. This wasn't about neighborhood gossip. This was about high-stakes political speech, and the authorities had very little tolerance for it. You wouldn't want to be caught singing a satirical song about the king's new wig if he was having a particularly bad hair day, or a bad divine right to rule day. It's important to recognize the limitations of the formal legal system in dealing with everyday gossip. Most minor instances of idle chatter, petty backbiting, or neighborhood rumors would never reach a courtroom. The law generally intervened only when the gossip escalated into clear slander, causing demonstrable harm. When it involved accusations of serious crime or immorality, or when it threatened public order or high authority, for the day-to-day management of less severe verbal transgressions. Communities relied more on those informal social sanctions, the church's moral guidance, or the very public shaming rituals we've discussed, which often operated in a gray area between formal law and popular justice. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval and early modern laws or local sumptuary regulations laws designed to regulate consumption and display of wealth occasionally attempted to control not just speech, but also other forms of perceived social disorder or moral laxity, such as excessive public laughter, loud or lewd singing in the streets, or even the playing of certain disreputable musical instruments in public. These all fell under a broad umbrella of trying to maintain a certain level of public decorum and moral propriety, with the underlying assumption that uncontrolled expressions could lead to broader social breakdown. Apparently, having too much fun, or being too loud about it, could also get you into trouble. Legal historians continue to debate the complex evolution of slander and libel law in early modern Europe, particularly noting significant shifts with the rise of print culture, the development of political pamphleteering and early newspapers, and the changing relationship between individual reputation, public opinion, and state power. The legal tools for dealing with harmful speech were constantly being adapted, refined, and sometimes fiercely contested. So, while the scold's bridle or the ducking stool might seem like relics of a bygone, almost folkloric system of justice, they existed within a broader context where formal law was also attempting, with varying degrees of success and fairness, to grapple with the immense power of words to wound, to deceive, and to disrupt. The reach of the law was often inconsistent, and its application could be heavily influenced by social status and gender. But the underlying principle was clear: your tongue, if wielded irresponsibly, could indeed lead you into very real legal jeopardy. We have spent a good deal of our sleepy journey exploring the rather inventive and very public ways in which early modern European communities attempted to control unruly tongues and punish those deemed to be notorious gossipers. Scolds, or slanderers. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the stocks, the pillory, the public penances of church courts, and the clamorous charivari. These were all fixtures of the social and judicial landscape for centuries. Yet, if you were to wander through a European town square in, say, the mid to late 19th century, you would be very unlikely to witness a woman being paraded in a brank or a baker being dunked for selling undersized loaves. These peculiar and highly visible shaming punishments, which had been such a prominent feature of life for so long, largely faded from use by the end of the early modern period and into the early decades of the 19th century. Why did this happen? What led to the decline and eventual disappearance of these once commonplace rituals of public degradation? The answers, as always in history, are complex and interwoven, reflecting profound shifts in legal thinking, social sensibilities, and the very nature of state power. One of the most significant drivers of this change was the intellectual and cultural movement known as the Enlightenment, which swept across Europe in the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers championed reason, individual rights, human dignity, and a more rational and humane approach to law and justice. Philosophers and legal reformers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy, with his influential treatise on crimes and punishments, 1764, and thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu in France, began to vigorously critique the arbitrary, cruel, and often ineffective nature of many traditional punishments. They argued that punishments should be proportionate to the crime, aimed at deterrence and reform rather than just brutal retribution or public spectacle, and that torture and cruel or unusual punishments had no place in a civilized society. During the late 18th and throughout the 19th centuries, as part of broader legal and penal reforms heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideals about human rights and rational justice, Public corporal and shaming punishments like the stocks, pillory, ducking stool, and scold's bridle were gradually abolished or fell into widespread disuse across most of Western Europe and North America, being largely replaced by imprisonment and other forms of state-controlled, less public punishment. The idea of deliberately inflicting intense public humiliation began to seem, at least to an influential segment of educated society, as barbaric and counterproductive. Perhaps an Enlightenment thinker might have mused, publicly chaining someone to a post and encouraging passers-by to pelt them with refuse is not the most effective way to foster a just and rational social order. Just a thought. Alongside these intellectual shifts, there were also changing social sensibilities, particularly among the growing middle and upper classes. A new emphasis on politeness, refinement, and public decorum began to take hold. The raw, boisterous, and often violent nature of public punishments like the pillory, where offenders could be seriously injured or even killed by the crowd, or the ducking stool started to seem increasingly distasteful, disorderly, and offensive to these emerging standards of public behavior. Such spectacles were seen less as righteous acts of communal justice and more as brutalizing and uncivilized displays that degraded both the punished and the onlookers. There was a growing preference for order, for decency, and for punishments to be carried out away from the public gaze, in a more controlled and less emotional manner. The rise of the modern state and the centralization of justice also played a crucial role. Throughout the early modern period, states were gradually consolidating their power, developing more professionalized bureaucracies, police forces, and court systems. This led to a desire for greater uniformity and control over the administration of justice. The often ad hoc, localized, and sometimes wildly variable nature of traditional shaming punishments didn't fit well with this move towards a more standardized, state-controlled legal apparatus. There was a shift towards imprisonment in penitentiaries or workhouses as the primary mode of punishment for many offenses. The idea was that confinement, hard labor, and moral instruction, however flawed these institutions often were in practice, would be more effective at reforming offenders, or at least removing them from society, than a few hours of public shame. Punishment became less of a public theatrical performance and more of a private, institutionalized process, carried out behind walls. No. Goodman Stocksley. A new government official might say to an old town beadle, "We don't pelt the slanderers with rotten cabbages anymore. We send them to the new House of Correction for 6 months of quiet contemplation and character-improving gruel. It's much more efficient." Legal reforms themselves directly targeted many of these old punishments. Laws were gradually codified, and specific statutes were passed in many countries to abolish or restrict the use of instruments like the pillory, the stocks, and the ducking stool. For example, the pillory was abolished for most offenses in England in 1816 and entirely in 1837. The ducking stool fell into disuse even earlier, with the last recorded official use of the ducking stool in England often being cited by historians as occurring in Leominster in 1809 for a woman named Jenny Pipes, or Sarah Leek accounts on the name vary, though some unofficial or isolated instances might have occurred slightly later. These legal changes reflected the evolving understanding of what constituted just and effective punishment. The decline in the power and jurisdiction of church courts in many Protestant regions, and even some shifts in emphasis within Catholic ones, also contributed. While churches remained concerned with moral conduct, their ability to impose coercive public penances often diminished as the authority of the secular state grew in matters of law and order. Slander and defamation became more exclusively matters for the civil or criminal courts, with financial damages or imprisonment as the more likely remedies rather than standing in a white sheet. Finally, broader economic and social changes played their part. The processes of industrialization and urbanization, which accelerated dramatically in the late 18th and 19th centuries, led to the growth of larger, more anonymous cities. In these vast new urban environments, the traditional shaming power of a small, tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other and reputation was paramount, was significantly diluted. Publicly shaming someone in a city of hundreds of thousands, where most onlookers were strangers, was simply less effective as a tool of social control than it had been in a village where the offender had to face their neighbors every day. The nature of community itself was changing. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even as these official public shaming punishments declined, some of their forms and functions were sometimes adopted or adapted by new social or political movements. For example, early trade unions or radical political groups might sometimes use forms of public denunciation, effigy burning, or social ostracism against perceived enemies or traitors to their cause. A kind of modern charivari? The desire to publicly shame those who violate group norms seems to be a persistent human impulse, even if the specific methods change. Historians debate whether the decline of these overt public shaming punishments was primarily due to the spread of humanitarian Enlightenment ideals percolating down through society. The practical needs of emerging industrial capitalist states for a more disciplined, mobile, and less feud-prone workforce. Fundamental changes in social sensibilities and the perceived efficacy of such public spectacles. Or a complex combination of all these factors interacting in different ways across different regions. It wasn't a single cause, but a slow tide of changing ideas, laws, and social structures that gradually consigned the scold's bridle and the ducking stool to the museum and the history books. The boring but profound shift was away from punishment as public theater and towards punishment as a more private, bureaucratic function of the state. And with that, the peculiar, public torment of the early modern gossiper largely faded into a rather uncomfortable memory. The scold's bridle now gathers dust in museum collections. The ducking stools have long since rotted away or become quaint local curiosities, and the pillory stands empty, a relic of a bygone era of justice. The peculiar public and often brutal punishments for gossipers, scolds, and slanderers that were so characteristic of early modern Europe have, thankfully, faded into history. But has the underlying anxiety about the power of words, the fear of reputational harm, and the urge to control or condemn those whose speech is deemed harmful or disruptive truly disappeared? Or have these ancient concerns simply shapeshifted, finding new expression in our modern, hyper-connected world? Let's gently reflect on how those early modern anxieties about evil tongues and pernicious prattle might echo, perhaps uncomfortably, in our own times of online banter, social media storms, and the 24/7 news cycle. If we compare the early modern world with our own, the differences in how information and misinformation spreads are, of course, staggering. In a 17th century village, gossip traveled at the speed of a human voice, from one ear to another, perhaps slowly percolating through the market square or the churchyard. A slanderous rumor might take days or weeks to fully permeate a local community. Today, a defamatory tweet, a viral video taken out of context, or a piece of fake news can circle the globe in minutes, reaching millions. Its digital footprint often impossible to erase completely. The scale and speed of potential reputational harm have been amplified beyond anything our early modern ancestors could have imagined. They worried about what Goody Higgins said over the back fence. We worry about what a million anonymous strangers might be saying on a Reddit thread. If only Goody Higgins had been limited to 140 characters. A modern social media manager might muse, my life would be so much simpler, and her scold's bridle would have needed a much smaller bell. The formal punishments for harmful speech have also changed dramatically. As we saw, the public physical shaming rituals have largely vanished from Western legal systems. Today, if someone slanders or libels you, your primary recourse is through civil law. You can sue for defamation, seeking financial damages and perhaps a retraction or apology. Criminal libel still exists in some jurisdictions, but it's used much more sparingly, usually reserved for cases involving incitement to hatred or threats to public order, not for everyday gossip. There are no more ducking stools, no more scold's bridles officially sanctioned by the state. However, if we look a little closer, perhaps the underlying anxieties and even some of the mechanisms of social control through shaming haven't entirely disappeared. They've just migrated to new platforms and adopted new forms. Consider the phenomenon of online cancellation or public pile-ons. When an individual says or does something that a significant segment of online opinion deems offensive or unacceptable, they can be subjected to a torrent of public condemnation, calls for them to lose their job or social standing, and intense personal attacks. While this isn't a physical punishment administered by a magistrate, the speed, scale, and ferocity of such online shaming can have devastating real-world consequences for a person's reputation, career, and mental well-being. It's a form of modern digitally mediated public humiliation that can feel, to the person experiencing it, as overwhelming and as socially isolating as being paraded in a brank might have felt in the 17th century. Think too of doxing, the malicious online publication of someone's private, identifying information like their home address or phone number with the intent to harass or intimidate them. This is a modern weaponization of information, a way to expose and endanger someone, often as a form of retribution for their words or actions, real or perceived. The early modern busybody who pried into their neighbors' affairs and spread secrets pales in comparison to the reach and potential harm of a dedicated online doxer. Even the act of a public apology via social media, now a common ritual after a public figure makes a misstep, can be seen as a faint echo of the public penances imposed by early modern church courts. The offender is expected to express contrition before the congregation of their online followers, their words scrutinized for sincerity, their digital white sheet moment often met with a mixture of acceptance, skepticism, or continued condemnation. Mainstream historical fact. While the specific physical instruments of public shaming from the early modern period are no longer in use in most Western societies, modern societies continue to grapple with new and evolving forms of reputational harm and social control facilitated by digital media, including online shaming, cyberbullying, the rapid spread of misinformation, fake news, and the challenges of regulating harmful speech in a globalized internet environment. The tools have changed, but the power of words to wound and the societal impulse to police transgressive speech remain. What about the gendered aspects of gossip and its policing? The stereotype of women as inherently more prone to malicious or trivial gossip certainly hasn't vanished entirely from popular culture, even if it's no longer enshrined in law as the offense of being a common scold. Women, particularly those in public life, often face a disproportionate amount of online harassment, shaming, and reputational attacks, much of it focused on their appearance, their private lives, or their perceived shrillness if they express strong opinions. Faint but discernible echoes of the anxieties that led to the scold's bridle. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that there are now online archives or encyclopedias dedicated to documenting particularly egregious social media pile-ons. Cancellations, or instances of online shaming. In some ways, these digital records serve a similar function to the old printed broadsides or last dying speeches that detailed the crimes and punishments of offenders in the early modern period. They create a form of public, lasting record of perceived transgression and its consequences, a warning to others, and a source of often schadenfreude-filled public interest. Sociologists, communication theorists, and media scholars continue to debate whether the dynamics of online shaming and so-called cancel culture represent a genuinely new form of social control unique to the digital age, or if they are largely contemporary manifestations of long-standing human behaviors related to gossip. Reputation management, communal boundary enforcement, and the policing of social norms, albeit now amplified and transformed by the speed, reach, and anonymity of internet technologies. Are we truly more enlightened than our early modern ancestors in how we deal with harmful or offensive speech? Or have the stocks and pillory simply been replaced by the Twitter storm and the Facebook flame war? It's a question worth pondering as you drift off. The boring persistence of human nature is certainly on display. The urge to talk about others, to share information and misinformation, to form in-groups and out-groups based on shared opinions or aversions, and the deep-seated fear of being talked about negatively, of having one's reputation destroyed. These are all as present today as they were in a 16th century village. The tools are different, the scale is vaster, but the underlying human drama of words, reputation, and social consequences continues. A long, unbroken thread from the age of branks and ducking stools to the era of online banter and viral takedowns. It makes you wonder what peculiar punishments future historians will find us guilty of in our own attempts to manage the ever-unruly human tongue. Our sleepy journey through the often uncomfortable, sometimes alarming, but always fascinating world of peculiar punishments for gossipers in early modern Europe is now drawing to its final, quiet reflections. We've seen the iron muzzles, the chilly ducking stools, the public displays in stocks and pillories. We've listened to the solemn pronouncements of church courts and the raucous community justice of the Charivari. We've pondered why words were considered such potent weapons, why women were so often the primary targets for control, and how these strange and brutal shaming rituals eventually faded from common practice. So, as the last echoes of rough music and the faint clank of the scold's bridle recede into the mists of history, what enduring lessons can we glean from these silenced voices and the societies that sought to control them? What do these peculiar punishments ultimately tell us about our early modern ancestors, and perhaps even a little about ourselves? One of the clearest lessons is the profound importance of community and conformity in these early modern societies. In a world where life was often precarious, where people lived in close, daily contact with their neighbors, and where social cohesion was seen as essential for survival, an individual whose words or behavior were perceived as disruptive or deviant was a genuine threat to the collective well-being. The public nature of these punishments, the bridal parade, the ducking, the pillorying, was designed not just to correct the offender but to reaffirm the community's shared values, its boundaries of acceptable behavior, and its collective power to enforce those boundaries. Your reputation wasn't just your own. It was part of the community's social fabric, and a tear in that fabric had to be publicly mended, however crudely. It was group therapy, but with less talking and more public humiliation. Remember, children, a village elder might say, pointing to the stocks. Our community is like a well-woven tapestry, one loose tongue, and the whole thing can start to unravel, or at least get very, very itchy. These punishments also cast a stark light on the power structures of the time. They reveal who had the authority to define disorderly speech, who decided what constituted a punishable offense, and who wielded the instruments of correction. It was often a combination of local magistrates representing secular law, church officials representing religious and moral law, and sometimes, as with Charivari, the unofficial but potent power of community elites or dominant social groups. The targets of these punishments were frequently those with less formal power women, the poor, religious, or social nonconformists. The ways in which speech was policed thus tell us a great deal about the distribution of power and the mechanisms by which social hierarchies were maintained. Nowhere is this clearer than in the gendered application of many of these punishments. The intense focus on controlling female speech, epitomized by the scold's bridle and the frequency with which women were subjected to the ducking stool for scolding, speaks volumes about the patriarchal anxieties of the age. A woman's voice, if deemed too loud, too assertive, too critical of male authority, or too free with neighborhood secrets, was often seen as a particular threat to domestic and social order. These punishments were a brutal way of reinforcing the ideal of the chaste, silent, and obedient woman. The silenced voices of these women, even if their original words are lost to us, still speak powerfully through the very instruments designed to mute them. The sheer effort expended on punishing gossip and slander underscores the immense value placed on reputation. In a world with few official records for ordinary people, no credit scores, no easily verifiable resumes, your good name was your currency, your collateral, your social security. It determined who would trust you, trade with you, marry you, or support you in times of need. The loss of that good name through malicious words could be catastrophic, a kind of social death. The punishments, however harsh, were seen by many as a necessary, if unpleasant, way to protect this vital, intangible asset. The prevalence of these practices also reflects a deep-seated fear of disorder in an age that was often anything but orderly. The early modern period was rife with religious wars, political upheavals, economic uncertainties, plagues, and famines. In such a volatile world, any perceived threat to local peace and stability, even if it was just words, could be met with a disproportionately harsh response. Controlling unruly tongues was part of a broader effort to control unruly times, to impose a semblance of order on a chaotic world. And finally, The eventual decline and disappearance of these public shaming punishments tells us something important about changing notions of justice, humanity, and the role of the state. The rise of Enlightenment ideals, the development of more centralized and rational legal systems, and evolving social sensibilities all contributed to a shift away from punishment as public spectacle and towards more private, institutionalized forms of correction. The study of historical punishments, including those for specific speech offenses like gossiping or scolding, provides invaluable insights into the social values, deeply embedded power dynamics, formal and informal legal systems, and the pervasive everyday anxieties of past societies. It's in these boring details, the mechanics of a ducking stool, the wording of a public penance, the specific complaints against a common scold, that we can often find the most intimate and revealing glimpses into the lived experience and mentalities of people in the past. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some museums that hold actual scolds' bridles, ducking stools, or pillories report that these objects are among their most popular, if unsettling, exhibits. They exert a morbid fascination, tangible relics of a system of social control that seems both alien and uncomfortably resonant. They make us question how far we've truly come, or if the methods of shaming have simply become less visible, less physical, but perhaps no less potent in their own way. Whether the decline of these overt public physical shaming punishments ultimately led to a more genuinely civilized or humane society, or simply shifted the primary mechanisms of social control to less immediately visible but potentially equally potent forms, such as economic coercion, institutionalization, mass media narratives, or indeed the dynamics of online shaming we discussed earlier, is a profound question that continues to provoke ongoing reflection among historians, sociologists, and social theorists. As we let the whispers of these silenced voices from early modern Europe fade into the quiet of the night, perhaps we can reflect on the enduring power of our own words, the responsibility that comes with speech, and the complex ways societies, past and present, have always sought to navigate that delicate balance between freedom of expression and the need for social harmony. It's a conversation that started long before us, and will undoubtedly continue long after we've drifted off to sleep. And with that final thought on the echoes of silenced voices, our exploration of the peculiar punishments for gossipers in early modern Europe gently comes to its conclusion. We have wandered through anxious towns and villages, examined the grim tools of public shaming, and listened to the clamor of community justice, all in an effort to understand how our ancestors dealt with the power of the spoken word. It has been a journey into a world where reputation was paramount, and a loose tongue could lead to some remarkably uncomfortable consequences. As the images of bridles and ducking stools, of pillories and public penances, begin to soften and dissolve in your mind, allow yourself to release the disquiet of these ancient practices. Let the knowledge of these past anxieties serve not to disturb your rest, but to deepen your appreciation for the quiet and safety of your own present moment. The clamor of the Charivari fades, the judgments of the church courts are done, and the market square stands empty and still in the imaginary moonlight. There are no more tales of public shaming to recount tonight, only the gentle invitation to your own peaceful and restorative sleep. Feel the comforting weight of your bedding, the steady rhythm of your breath, as you drift further and further from the shores of wakefulness. Any lingering thoughts of early modern justice can now be set aside, like old court records filed away in a dusty archive. You are here, now, in a place of peace and tranquility. Allow your mind to become still, your body to relax completely, and surrender to the soft embrace of sleep. May your dreams be filled with kindness, and your rest be deep and untroubled. Sweet dreams.